I was sitting at a table at a beautiful wedding. The room was full of people dressed in their finest. The music was soft. The flowers were perfect. The evening was exactly what a wedding evening should be. And then my brother walked up behind me and yanked my chair hard enough that I grabbed the table to stop myself from falling. 100 people saw it. The room went silent. And then the groom, the man whose wedding it was, stood up from the head table. And what he said next is something I will remember for the rest of my life. Welcome to Haely Stories. This is the place where you will find real and emotional women's stories that will touch your heart, make you feel seen, and remind you that you are never alone in what you are going through. If that is something you need in your life, then like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a single story. Now let me tell you about the wedding where my brother chose to humiliate me in front of 100 strangers, and the man I had never properly met who decided that was not going to happen. My name is Misha Poss and I am 29 years old. I want to start by telling you about my brother, because understanding him is essential to understanding what happened at that wedding and why it happened the way it did. My brother's name is Leo. He is 4 years older than me, 33 now, and he has been, for most of my life, the most complicated relationship I have. Not the most painful. Not the most destructive. The most complicated. The kind of complicated that comes from loving someone who has also, at various points, gone out of his way to make you feel small. Leo and I grew up in the same house with the same parents and we had, by any external measure, a similar childhood. But siblings absorb family dynamics differently, and what Leo absorbed, somewhere along the way, was a need to be the dominant presence in every room he entered. He needed to be funnier, louder, more important. And when he could not be those things naturally, he sometimes manufactured situations that would make him appear so. I was often the material he used to manufacture those situations. Not always. Leo was also capable of genuine warmth and genuine loyalty, and there were periods of our adult lives where we had something that felt like a real friendship. But the cruelty, the specific and targeted cruelty of a brother who knew exactly which words and which actions would land most effectively, was always there underneath the warmth, available when he needed it. At the wedding it was not underneath anything. I want to tell you about the wedding. The wedding was not a family wedding. It was the wedding of a colleague, a woman named Priya who worked in my department and who had become a genuine friend over the 3 years we had worked together. She was warm and funny, and she had invited me to her wedding with the specific and personal warmth of someone who meant it, not the social obligation warmth of someone filling a table. I had been looking forward to it. Leo was also there. Not because he knew Priya, he did not know her well. But because Priya's husband, a man named James, had been friends with Leo for years. They had met through a mutual connection and had maintained the kind of easy, occasional friendship that exists between men who like each other without needing to see each other frequently. I had not known Leo would be at the wedding until I arrived and saw his name card at a nearby table. I want to be honest about what I felt when I saw it. I felt a small, familiar tightening. The particular adjustment that happens when you encounter someone whose presence requires a certain amount of management. I told myself it would be fine. It was a wedding. There were 100 people. The occasion itself would keep things civil. I was wrong about that. I need to tell you what had happened between Leo and me in the months before the wedding, because it is directly relevant to what he did. 6 months earlier, at a family dinner, Leo had said something about my work. A dismissive comment, the kind he was skilled at, the kind that lands as a joke but functions as a diminishment, and I had, for the first time in my adult life, responded to it directly rather than absorbing it quietly. I had said, "Leo, that is not funny and I need you to stop doing that." The table had gone quiet. Leo had looked at me with an expression I had not seen before, surprised, and then something harder than surprised. He had said something that I will not repeat here, and then he had moved on, and the dinner had continued, and everyone had pretended it had not happened. But something had shifted between us. Leo did not like being called out. Not privately and certainly not at a table. He had spent the 6 months since that dinner being very specifically cold to me, not hostile, not in any way that would require him to explain himself, but cold in the particular way of someone who has decided that a payback is owed and is waiting for the right moment to collect it. He chose a wedding, he chose a room with 100 people in it. And he chose a chair. The wedding was everything it should have been. The ceremony was beautiful, intimate and genuine, the specific quality of two people who actually meant what they were saying to each other and were not performing it. Priya cried at one point and laughed immediately after, and James looked at her the way people look at someone they have decided they cannot imagine being without. The reception was at a hotel ballroom that had been arranged with the particular care of people who had thought about every detail. Round tables with white and green flowers. Soft lighting. A band that played during dinner and then dance music afterward. I was at a table with 4 other colleagues and 2 people I did not know. Leo was at the table directly adjacent, close enough that I was aware of him throughout the dinner, which required a certain amount of the familiar management energy. The dinner passed without incident. The speeches were wonderful. Priya's father made everyone laugh, James's best friend made everyone cry, and then James himself said something to Priya that was so completely and unaffectedly loving that half the room needed a moment. It was, until the moment it was not, a perfect evening. I was talking to the colleague beside me. We were deep in a conversation about something completely unrelated to the wedding, the comfortable side conversation that happens at receptions when the formal parts are done, when I felt it. The chair yanked from beneath me. Hard. Deliberate. The specific force of someone who had thought about what they were doing and had decided to do it properly. I grabbed the table. The conversation around me stopped immediately. Then the conversations at the nearest tables. Then, in the particular wave that moves through a room when something unexpected happens, the whole room noticed. I turned around. Leo was standing behind my chair with a grin that was not a grin at all. It was the expression he wore when he had done something he had intended to do and was now framing it as a joke so that any objection I raised would look like an overreaction. He said, "Relax, Misha. It was just a prank." The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something has happened that nobody is sure how to respond to. I was still holding the table. My heart was hammering. Not from fear, from the particular combination of shock and humiliation and the immediate calculation of how to respond to something that had just happened publicly in a room full of people I mostly did not know. I had about 2 seconds of that calculation before the situation changed. I heard a chair push back at the head table. I turned. James, the groom, the man whose wedding it was, the man I had met perhaps twice in passing, was standing up. He was still in his wedding suit. The room's attention, which had been split between me and Leo, moved to him with the particular unanimity of a crowd that understands something significant is happening. He walked from the head table to where I was sitting. He looked at Leo. And then he said something that made the room hold its breath. He said, "Leo, I need you to step outside with me for a moment." His voice was completely even. Not raised. Not theatrical. The voice of a man who was entirely in control of himself and intended to remain so. Leo said, "James, come on, it was just a joke." James said, "I know you think it was. Step outside with me, please." Something in the way he said please made it clear that please was not optional. Leo stepped outside. James looked at me before he followed. He said, "I am sorry, Misha. Give me a few minutes." Then he walked out after my brother. The room did not immediately return to normal. There was a period, perhaps 2 minutes, of the careful recalibration that happens after something public and uncomfortable has been interrupted but not yet resolved. Conversations resumed at a lower register. People looked at their plates and their glasses and carefully nodded at me. Priya appeared at my shoulder. She crouched down beside my chair and she said, quietly, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am fine." "I am so sorry, your wedding." She said, "Stop. Are you actually okay?" I said, "Yes. I am embarrassed but I am okay." She said, "You have nothing to be embarrassed about." She squeezed my hand and then stood up and went back to the head table with the composure of a bride who has decided that her wedding will not be defined by what just happened and is making that true through sheer force of calm. I sat with my water glass and I waited. James came back in 5 minutes later. Alone. He walked to the head table and sat down and said something quietly to Priya and she nodded. Leo did not come back. I found out later, from a mutual friend who had been nearby, what James had said to Leo outside. He had said, "Leo, Misha is a guest at my wedding and you just physically pulled her chair in front of 100 people. I do not know what is between you and I do not need to know. What I need you to understand is that this is my wedding and she is my guest and what you just did is not acceptable. If you cannot treat her with basic respect, you cannot be here tonight." Leo had said it was a joke and he was being oversensitive. James had said, "Perhaps. But it is my wedding and I get to decide what happens at it. You are welcome to stay if you can behave appropriately toward every guest in this room. If you cannot, I will need you to leave." Leo had left, the rest of the wedding was, and I say this knowing how strange it sounds given what had happened, genuinely wonderful. The band played. People danced. Priya and James had their first dance to a song that made everyone in the room feel something, and the dancing that followed was the loose and joyful kind that happens when a room has been through something slightly difficult and has decided, collectively, to enjoy the rest of the evening more deliberately because of it. I danced. I talked. I had a glass of wine and a long conversation with one of James's friends who turned out to be one of the most interesting people I had spoken to in months. At one point in the evening James found me at the bar. He said, "I want to check in. How are you doing?" I said, "I am doing well." "James, I want to thank you for what you did." He said, "You do not need to thank me. What he did was wrong." I was not going to pretend it was not. I said, "A lot of people in that room pretended it was not." He said, "I know. But it is my wedding and I have some authority over what happens at it." I said, "You used it well." He said, "I should have noticed sooner. I saw the dynamic between you and him during dinner and I should have done something before it reached the point it reached." I said, "You could not have known." He said, "No. But I am sorry it happened here. At what should have been just a nice evening." I said, "It was a nice evening. It still was." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You handled it with a lot of dignity." I said, "I was holding the table." He laughed. A genuine laugh. The kind that breaks tension in the best way. Leo called me the following day. I answered because I had already decided I would. Not because I wanted to smooth things over, I did not. But because I wanted to have the conversation from a position of clarity rather than avoidance. He said, "About last night?" I said, "Yes." He said, "James overreacted." I said, "Leo, James asked you to treat his guest with basic respect and when you indicated you could not do that he asked you to leave. I do not think that is an overreaction." He said, "It was a joke, Misha." I said, "You physically pulled my chair in a room of 100 people. I nearly fell. That is not a joke. A joke is something both people find funny. What you did was designed to humiliate me." He was quiet. I said, "I need to say something to you that I should have said a long time ago. You have been doing versions of this my whole life. Finding public moments to make me the butt of something. Framing cruelty as humor so that any objection I raise looks like oversensitivity. I have been absorbing it for 29 years and I am telling you now, clearly and directly, that I will not absorb it anymore." He said, "You are being dramatic." I said, "Leo, a groom stood up from his own wedding reception to tell you that what you had done was unacceptable. If you are still telling yourself it was just a joke, I think you need to sit with that." He did not respond immediately. Then he said, "I did not think it would, I did not think James would react like that." I said, "You did not think anyone would say anything. That is why you did it. You have been doing these things in rooms where you calculated no one would say anything. Last night someone said something. He said, I was embarrassed. I said, yes. I imagine you were. Now you understand what embarrassment in a room full of people feels like. The conversation with Leo did not resolve everything. Conversations like that rarely do. What it did was establish something that had not been established before. A clear and named understanding between us that the pattern of behavior was visible to me, that I had named it, and that I would not be absorbing it quietly going forward. Leo's response to having something named and held accountable was, in the weeks after, to be somewhat chastened in a way that I observed without fully trusting. He was less loud around me. Less pointed. Whether that was genuine recalibration or simply a temporary adjustment in the face of consequences, I could not yet tell. I was honest with myself about not knowing. My mother called me after she heard what had happened. Family information travels, as it always does, and she said she was sorry. She said she had known for years that Leo's behavior toward me was not always what it should be, and she had not addressed it as directly as she should have. I appreciated her saying that. I told her so. Priya sent me a message the day after the wedding that I have saved. She said the evening had been perfect despite what happened, and that watching James stand up and handle it the way he did had been one of her favorite moments of the whole day, not because of the drama of it but because of what it showed her about the man she had just married. That was a beautiful thing to take from a difficult moment. Want to tell you a little about what happened with James and Priya after the wedding because I think it is part of the story. I saw them both about a month later at a work event Priya invited me to. James was there and we talked properly for the first time, not in the charged context of the wedding but in the ordinary context of two people being introduced at a party through a mutual friend. He was, as he had appeared at the wedding, exactly himself. Not performing the decent thing he had done. Not expecting gratitude for it. Simply a person who had seen something wrong and said so and had moved on without making himself the center of what had happened. I told Priya, privately, that she had married someone genuinely good. She said, I know. It took me a while to understand how rare that is. I have thought about that conversation many times since, not because of any romantic feeling toward James. He is my friend's husband and there is nothing complicated about my regard for him. But because of what it illustrated. That decency, when you encounter it in the specific and unperforming form that James showed at that wedding, has a quality that is unmistakable. He did not stand up because it was the right thing to do in any calculated sense. He stood up because he saw something wrong happening at his wedding and he was not the kind of person who could watch that and say nothing. That is a quality I had not encountered often enough in my life. I am paying more attention to it now. I am 29 years old and my brother pulled my chair at a wedding in front of 100 people and a man I barely knew stood up from his own reception to stop it. I want to tell you what I know now. I know that the people who have been diminishing you count on your silence. Leo had been doing versions of what he did at that wedding for 29 years and I had absorbed almost all of it because I had calculated that the cost of naming it was higher than the cost of enduring it. That calculation was wrong. The cost of enduring it accumulated. The cost of naming it, when it finally happened, was one difficult phone call and a brother who was still figuring out what to do with having been held accountable. I know that decency is rarer and more valuable than it should be. James standing up from his wedding reception was not a grand gesture. It was a simple and clear response to something wrong happening in a room he was responsible for. But it landed like something significant because it was so uncommon. So many people had watched similar things happen in similar rooms and had said nothing. He said something. I also know something about what I want from the people in my life going forward. I want the James quality. Not in any specific person, but as a standard. The willingness to say something when something wrong is happening. The willingness to stand up when standing up is required. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Just clearly and without apology. I had not been looking for that quality explicitly before the wedding. I am looking for it now. And I know something about myself that I am choosing to hold carefully. I grabbed the table. I did not fall. That matters. My name is Misha Poss. I am 29 years old. My brother tried to humiliate me in front of 100 wedding guests. The groom stood up and stopped him. And that is my story. He pulled the chair to make me fall. I grabbed the table. And then a man I barely knew stood up from his own wedding to make sure I did not have to hold on alone. That is the part one will remember longest. Thank you for listening. This is Haely Stories. We will see you in the next one.